In the heart of Louisiana's Delta country, where the morning mist clings to the land like an unshaken dream, there lies a stretch of earth whispered about in hushed tones, the Holloway Plantation. On the surface, it is a relic of southern grandeur, its skeletal remains still framed by sagging oaks heavy with moss, but locals speak of it as though it were alive, breathing, listening. They say the ground itself has memory, and that it remembers in blood. The cotton here once grew taller, whiter, softer than anywhere else in the parish, but the yield came at a price no one dared to name aloud. Neighbors told of nights when the wind carried more than the scent of damp earth, when it carried cries, sharp and distant, as though torn from another time. Some believed the soil was rich not with minerals, but with the remnants of those who toiled and died here, and the Holloways, it seems, were never bothered by ghosts. The Holloway name first appeared in Louisiana court records in 1798, attached to a man described simply as of foreign birth, possessing uncommon ambition. Nathaniel Holloway had arrived from the English port city of Bristol with little more than a modest inheritance and a hunger that seemed to gnaw at him from the inside. In a matter of years, he had transformed a modest plot of land into a sprawling cotton empire, acquiring enslaved men, women, and children with a precision that felt less like business and more like the cold mathematics of ownership. Other planters might have been feared for their tempers, their whips, or their greed, but Holloway inspired a quieter kind of dread. Former rivals spoke of his uncanny luck, fields immune to blight, shipments always arriving ahead of schedule, debts paid before they were due. Yet behind this prosperity was a pattern of vanishing lives. Newly purchased slaves who never appeared on the plantation's public rolls, labor, were suddenly missing after harvest celebrations, itinerant workers who came seeking wages and were never seen again. By the early 1800s, the Holloway holdings stretched for miles, swallowing smaller farms like a tide creeping inland. He built the Grand Manor not just as a symbol of wealth, but as a fortress of control. Its locked upper floors and cellar chambers known only to family and a trusted overseer. Even among the enslaved population, a hierarchy emerged. Those who worked the visible fields and kitchens, and those who were summoned inside and never returned. Nathaniel's journals, later found in a sealed trunk, reveal not the confessions of a guilty man, but the proud musings of one who believed his success was destiny. In one entry, he wrote, "The land responds to sacrifice, as all fruitful things must." He made no distinction between a row of cotton and a human life. Both, to him, were crops to be cultivated and harvested. Neighbors and business partners may have quietly disapproved, but the wealth he generated silenced their tongues. In the antebellum South, morality often bent beneath the weight of profit, and in Holloway's case, that profit seemed limitless, though more than one man wondered, in private, whether something other than hard work had built the dynasty that now ruled these blood-fed fields. In the summer of 1812, a violent storm rolled in from the Gulf, tearing branches from the oaks and rattling the windows of the Holloway Manor. That night, Nathaniel Holloway dismissed his household early, ordering even his overseer to remain in the slave quarters until morning. Only one person was permitted inside the house after dark, a traveling conjurer from New Orleans. A wiry man with eyes so pale they seemed almost blind. He carried no luggage save for a small weathered box bound with iron clasps. Neighbors later claimed they saw the two men ascend to the attic with candles in hand. For hours, the flicker of firelight pulsed from the upper window, and muffled chanting rose above the roar of the storm. At some point, the wind died, but the voices did not. One farmhand swore he heard a scream, high and sharp, not from pain, but from something like triumph. By morning, the conjurer was gone. No carriage tracks, no farewells, no payment recorded in the Holloway ledger. Nathaniel emerged pale but composed, his clothes marked with ash and something darker spattered at the hem. Within weeks, the plantation's fortunes swelled. Cotton yields doubled, debts evaporated, and trade routes opened as if by providence. Yet alongside this prosperity came a surge in accidents. Field hands crushed by falling beams, children disappearing on their way to the well, livestock found drained of blood. The ledger began recording unusual expenditures, exotic herbs, iron chains in odd lengths, and shipments of salt by the barrel. The attic, once used for storage, was locked permanently. Even the Holloway children were forbidden to enter, and those who disobeyed spoke of carvings in the beams, symbols that twisted in the eye until their shapes could not be remembered. Some swore that if you stood beneath that attic window at night, you could hear a slow, deliberate tapping, as though someone inside were marking time. Nathaniel never spoke of the storm or the man with the iron-bound box, but his journals became more cryptic after that night. In one entry, he wrote only, "The bargain holds, the land is satisfied for now." The Holloway manor was built to impress from the outside. White columns, sweeping porches, polished floors, but beneath its grandeur lay a world no guest was ever meant to see. Hidden behind the kitchen's brick hearth was a narrow door leading to stone steps that sank into the earth. Few outside the family ever descended those stairs, but those who did carried the memory to their graves. In the dim torchlight, the walls of the cellar bore strange, deliberate marks, circles intersected by jagged lines etched deep into the stone. Heavy iron rings were fixed into the masonry at ankle height, each connected to chains no longer than a man's arm. The air was damp, tinged with iron and something older, something sweetly rotten. These were not storage rooms for grain or wine. They were holding cells, but of a kind that spoke to purpose beyond confinement. Survivors who later escaped the Holloway property described being dragged here for correction. They spoke of nights when the family gathered in the shadows, whispering words no one could understand. The punishment was not always violent in the physical sense. Sometimes it was silence, hours, even days, left in darkness, listening to sounds that weren't footsteps but something slower, dragging across the stone. One former house servant claimed that after certain nights the chains would be warm to the touch, though the air below was always cold. Another swore that small animal bones, never whole, would appear in the corners without explanation. Census records from the era show unexplained drops in the enslaved population, losses attributed to illness or flight, though no runaway notices were ever posted. It was as if these lives had been erased, their absence absorbed by the soil above. The Holloways never spoke of the basement, and even the overseer avoided the steps after dark. Yet shipments of iron shackles and stone mortar appeared regularly in the plantation's accounts, long after there was any practical need for them. Whatever was done in those rooms, it was not meant to be witnessed. And whatever its purpose, it was guarded with a zeal far stronger than mere discipline, suggesting that what lay beneath Holloway Manor was not just a prison, but an altar. From the outside, the Holloway cotton fields looked like a painter's dream, endless rows of white bowls swaying under the Louisiana sun, the air thick with the hum of cicadas. Year after year, their harvest was nothing short of miraculous. Droughts that withered neighboring farms left Holloway stalks untouched. Insect infestations seemed to skirt the property line, as though turned back by some unseen barrier. Even in seasons when the Mississippi overflowed and drowned crops for miles, the Holloways gathered their usual abundance. Local farmers muttered about trickery, secret irrigation systems, imported fertilizers, but no one could explain why the yield didn't just survive hardship, it thrived in it. In the town ledgers, Holloway cotton fetched higher prices, its fibers unusually strong, its color almost blindingly white. Some claimed it never yellowed with age, yet behind the bounty was a ledger of the dead. The same. Years that saw record harvests also recorded sudden drops in the plantation's enslaved population. An elderly freedwoman, years later, would recall nights when they took the strongest among us, and the next day the fields looked fuller, like the plants had drunk deep. Her words carried a weight that silenced even those eager to dismiss superstition. Rumors spread of midnight gatherings in the fields when lanterns bobbed between the rows and strange chanting rose into the dark. Slaves locked in their cabins spoke of the smell of blood drifting on the night breeze, mingling with the sweet scent of cotton. Some swore they heard the earth groan, like something beneath the soil was moving. The Holloways kept their methods secret, brushing off questions with polite smiles and generous donations to the church. But in private, Nathaniel's surviving notes hinted at a philosophy as old as agriculture itself. All growth demands a price. A field will feed a man only if fed in kind. Whether the family believed in divine favor, dark pacts, or merely their own ruthlessness, the result was the same. Holloway land was never barren, and its yield never waned. And for those who worked it, the harvest felt less like nature's gift than the return on an unholy investment. In 1851, during repairs to a crumbling wall in the old overseer's quarters, a mason uncovered a narrow cavity sealed with lime. Inside lay a leather-bound book, brittle with age and warped by damp. Its cover bore no name, but the handwriting within belonged to Elias Kerr, the Holloways' longest-serving overseer, a man both feared and despised for his cold efficiency. At first glance, the ledger appeared to be routine plantation records, work assignments, supply inventories, weather notes. But woven between the mundane entries were passages marked with small crosses in the margins. These entries described special selections of slaves, chosen not for their skill or strength, but for fitness to the right. Some were singled out for night service in the cellar. Others were offered to the rows under moonless skies. No wages, no return. Kerr's precision was unnerving. He noted the exact hour each person was taken, the Holloway family members present, and peculiar preparations. Salted water, carved stones, lengths of black ribbon. In some entries, a cryptic phrase replaced names entirely. 3 for the seed, 1 to still the wind. Cross-referencing the ledger with surviving census records revealed disturbing gaps. Entire families vanished between one tally and the next, their absence explained only in Kerr's private code. No runaway ads were posted, no burials recorded. It was as if they had been swallowed whole by the land itself. In the margins, a handful of personal reflections broke through Kerr's otherwise mechanical tone. One read, "The lady insists the words must be perfect, else the yield will sour." Another simply stated, "I no longer sleep." Historians debate whether the ledger was evidence of ritual sacrifice or merely coded cruelty. But for those who've studied the Holloway history, its alignment with the plantation's most prosperous seasons is impossible to ignore. Whatever these rites were, they seemed to coincide with bursts of unnatural abundance. The ledger vanished soon after its discovery. The mason who found it sold the book to a private collector in Baton Rouge, but within months, both the buyer and the book disappeared, leaving only Kerr's name, his meticulous handwriting, and a whisper of the truth behind Holloway prosperity. When Nathaniel Holloway collapsed in his study in the winter of 1838, his death was ruled sudden apoplexy. The mourners, however, noted something stranger. The widow, Eleanor Holloway, did not shed a single tear. Draped in black from neck to heel, she accepted condolences with a composure that unsettled even the most hardened planters' wives. Some whispered she looked relieved, as though a long and tiresome burden had been lifted. Within weeks, Eleanor assumed full control of the estate. Her management was swift and absolute, contracts redrawn, debts collected, and old alliances severed without hesitation. But it was her nighttime habits that began to trouble the town. Lantern light was often seen weaving through the cotton rows long after midnight, accompanied by the faint, melodic hum of an old lullaby. Slaves who worked the fields swore that the song was not meant for the living. The disappearances began soon after. 2 young enslaved boys, barely 12, vanished from their quarters. A free black seamstress who had been commissioned to alter gowns for the widow never returned home. Even the plantation's own cook, a woman in service for 20 years, was gone by spring. Eleanor's grip on the land was matched only by her influence over its people. The overseer's ledger from this period showed an uptick in night service entries, always marked with a small symbol resembling a crescent moon. The yield that year was the highest in Holloway history. Visitors described the widow as graceful but chilling, her voice soft, her eyes fixed as though she were always listening for something far away. She rarely left the property except to visit a secluded grove just beyond the northern field. There, she was seen kneeling in the dirt, her hands pressed flat against the ground. Some claimed she spoke to the land, bargaining with it as her husband once had. Others insisted she was simply mad with grief, though grief does not usually leave such a perfect, profitable order in its wake. Eleanor Holloway reigned for 9 years, and in that time, the plantation grew richer, but the air around it grew heavier. By the time she died, the Holloway name was untouchable, and so was its curse. In the spring of 1844, the Holloway estate prepared for a wedding, an event that should have symbolized renewal and prosperity. Instead, it became one of the most unsettling spectacles the parish had ever witnessed. Eleanor Holloway's only son, Charles, was to marry a young woman from the Beaumont family, a union promising to merge 2 of the region's most formidable fortunes. Invitations went out to every prominent household, but when the guests arrived, they were met not with blossoms and bright ribbons, but with a scene of calculated mourning. The manor was draped in black crepe from roofline to foundation. The wedding arch was built of twisted cypress limbs, their bark scorched to charcoal. Along the edge of the property, livestock carcasses, goats, pigs, even a bull, had been slaughtered and arranged in a deliberate perimeter, their blood pooling into the grass. No expla, a nation was offered. Inside, the ceremony was brief and silent, save for the minister's voice and the echo of crows circling overhead. The bride wore not white, but a deep crimson gown that seemed almost to absorb the candlelight. Her veil was black lace, heavy enough to obscure her face entirely. When she was presented as Mrs. Charles Holloway, she did not lift it. Servants whispered of what happened after the vows, that the couple vanished upstairs for hours, leaving the guests to eat in strained silence. By the time they returned, the bride's veil was gone, and her eyes were swollen as if from weeping, or something worse. Within weeks, the Beaumont fortune was consolidated under Holloway control. The bride was rarely seen outside the manor after that day. Some said she had taken ill. Others claimed they heard her pacing in the attic late at night, muttering in a voice that was not quite her own. The wedding marked a shift in the plantation's atmosphere. The fields flourished as never before, but the human cost deepened. More disappearances, more night services. And from that spring onward, No one who attended the wedding could shake the feeling that it had been less a celebration than a covenant, one sealed in darkness, under the watchful gaze of something far older than the Holloways themselves. In the blistering summer of 1852, laborers clearing an overgrown corner of the Holloway property uncovered a stone well, its mouth sealed with a heavy slab. The structure was old, older, some believed, than the plantation itself. Its stones slick with moss, the mortar crumbling like damp bread. The overseer ordered it opened, perhaps hoping to find a fresh water source. What they found instead turned the men to silence. Beneath the slab, the air was sour and heavy. At the bottom, tangled in a mat of rotted cloth, lay the skeletal remains of at least 7 children. Their bones were small but unmistakably human, many showing unnatural fractures, clean breaks in limbs, cracks in skulls that could not be explained by a simple fall. No one admitted to knowing who they were. There were no burial records, no mention of illness, no runaway notices for missing youth. The only clue came from a scrap of embroidered cloth still clinging to one tiny ribcage, stitched with a symbol that matched markings found carved in the Holloway cellar walls. The widow Eleanor refused to address the discovery, instructing that the well be resealed before word could spread. Those who'd seen its contents whispered that the bones had been deliberately arranged, their small hands folded inwards, palms against their own chests, as if holding something invisible. An elderly field hand, speaking decades later, recalled hearing the faint sound of singing near that well on certain nights, long before it was found. The song, she said, was not in any language she knew, but it carried the same rhythm as a mother rocking a child. The well was buried under fresh earth within days, but its location remained a point of unease for those who worked nearby. Tools would go missing, livestock would shy away, and some swore that if you stood over the spot in the still of night, you could feel a faint breath rising from below. In parish history, the incident was never recorded, erased like so much else in Holloway lore. But among those who heard the story firsthand, it became an unspoken truth. The Holloways did not simply work their children, they harvested them. By the late summer of 1871, the Holloway name had begun to curdle in the mouths of their neighbors. Whispers of missing workers, unexplained fires, and strange nocturnal gatherings in the main hall had filtered into nearby towns. But it was the vanishing of Elias Holloway, the youngest son and, by most accounts, the gentlest of the clan, that turned rumor into obsession. Elias was not like the others. Where his brothers barked orders and carried whips as casually as pocket knives, Elias had been known to pause during inspections, speak softly to the enslaved, and even secretly slip food to starving families. Some believed he was destined to break the Holloway curse, to turn the plantation into something less cruel. But on a muggy August night, he simply vanished. The official story was clumsy. Elias had ridden out alone to inspect the far fields and never returned. Search parties found his horse days later, tied to a cypress near the bayou, its saddle slick with dried blood that was not its own. No body was recovered. Those inclined to superstition whispered that the swamp had claimed him, that the restless dead had dragged him under its black water in retribution for his family's sins. Others believed his disappearance was an inside job, a Holloway solution to a Holloway problem. The theory went that Elias had grown too sympathetic, too ready to talk, perhaps even to expose family secrets that had kept them untouchable for decades. Late one night, a field hand swore he saw lanterns bobbing in the marsh, followed by muffled voices, Holloway voices, arguing in the dark. When pressed, the man refused to say more, claiming that speaking of it would wake the shadows. In the years after, some swore they saw Elias on the property's edge, standing still as a fence post, his white shirt glowing in the moonlight. They said he never moved, never spoke, only stared toward the plantation house as if trying to remember something he'd left behind. Whether it was a ghost, a warning, or simply a story meant to keep children from wandering too far, no one could say. But his absence left a hollow in the family, a void that would be filled not with grief, but with more secrets. When the Holloway name finally began to crumble under debt and scandal, most of the hired help fled the estate, as if the very air had turned poisonous. But a handful remained, men and women who had no blood ties to the family, yet seemed bound to the land by something deeper, something that went beyond loyalty. They were not new hires. Most had been born on the plantation, their parents and grandparents before them serving Holloways for generations. Locals noticed these servants rarely ventured into town, and when they did, they spoke little and kept their eyes low. They never complained, never hinted at unhappiness. It was as though they had made an unspoken pact to endure whatever lingered within those walls. One elderly ground scout, Eeper, known simply as Old Sam, claimed the Holloways had fed the soil, and that the soil fed back. He would never explain what that meant. Even after the mansion began to rot and rooms stood empty, the servants moved through its halls like keepers in a crypt, dusting furniture no one sat on, lighting lamps in rooms no one entered. Some whispered that they were waiting, not for the Holloways to return, but for something else entirely. Travelers who wandered too close to the estate after dark swore they saw candlelight moving from window to window, as if the house was being prepared for a guest. In time, the names of these servants vanished from public records. No births, no deaths, no forwarding addresses. It was as though they simply dissolved into the place itself. The townspeople didn't bother searching. In their minds, anyone who stayed on Holloway land had already crossed a threshold that the living should never cross. By the late 1880s, whispers began to ripple through the nearby towns, not about the Holloway men or their bloody tempers, but about the children. At first, it seemed like a cruel rumor, the sort of idle talk that clings to powerful families. Yet the pattern was undeniable. Families who worked the plantation or lived in its shadow spoke of little ones who went missing without a trace. Some were children of field hands, others from nearby settlements, and a few were said to be kin to the Holloways themselves, though no one dared speak their names aloud. The disappearances often coincided with moonless nights, when the air felt heavy and the swamp hummed low like a warning. Mothers would lock their doors and keep their children close. Yet somehow, the next morning, a bed would be empty. There were no bodies, no ransom notes, only a silence so deep it felt deliberate. Local lawmen showed no interest in investigating. The Holloways' influence ran thicker than any badge. Those who asked too many questions were soon found packing their belongings and leaving town under mysterious circumstances. The strangest accounts came from the few who swore they had seen the missing children again, months or even years later, wandering the plantation grounds at dusk. They looked pale, their clothes ragged, their eyes vacant, as if they had forgotten who they once were. One man claimed to have spoken to a boy he recognized from a neighbor's family, but when he asked where the boy had been, the child only shook his head and whispered, "I can't go home." Rumors took root that the Holloways were keeping them, training them, using them, perhaps for labor, perhaps for something darker no one dared define. Some believed the swamp itself had taken them, that the Holloways had made some unholy pact with the land, and the children were the price. Even decades later, when the plantation had begun to rot into the earth, parents would warn their children, "Don't go near the Holloway grounds or you'll join the others." Whether the Holloways were the thieves of youth or merely the keepers of an ancient curse, one thing was certain. Those children never came back the same. The Holloway dining room was a display of calculated intimidation. A long mahogany table polished to a black sheen, lit by the harsh glare of a crystal chandelier that seemed to catch and trap every flicker of candlelight. Here, business was conducted, alliances forged, and enemies, both imagined and real, were made to squirm. But over time, it became a place where trust went to die. It began with small incidents: a guest falling ill after a lavish supper, a servant collapsing in the kitchen hours after tasting a sauce. At first, the Holloways blamed bad oysters, spoiled wine, or the swamp's relentless humidity. But whispers crept through the household that the sickness was not natural, that it was planned. The matriarch, Ruth Holloway, was said to watch her guests as they ate, her gaze fixed and unblinking, as though counting the moments until her handiwork took hold. One of the more enduring stories tells of a rival landowner who came to negotiate a boundary dispute. He left the plantation that night in a carriage, clutching his stomach, and was found dead in his bed the next morning. His body bore no signs of struggle, but the coroner noted an unmistakable bitterness on his tongue. The staff, trapped between loyalty and fear, began to follow unspoken rules. Never drink from the same decanter as the guests, never taste the soup after Ruth entered the kitchen, and always, always keep your head down when she poured wine. By the late 1870s, the Holloway dining table had gained a grim reputation. Invitations to dinner became both an honor and a warning. To accept meant acknowledging that you might not leave with your health or your life intact. Yet people still came. Such was the pull of the Holloway name and the strange, dangerous glamour that surrounded them. Some claimed Ruth's poisons were never meant to kill outright, but to weaken, to remind her adversaries that she could reach them even in moments of pleasure. Others insisted she relished the kill. The truth is buried with the guests who never finished their meals, their final bites still lingering in the shadows of that cursed table. By the early 1890s, the Holloway name had become synonymous with both prestige and suspicion. Publicly, the family maintained their veneer of respectability: grand dinners, charitable donations, and careful appearances in church. But beneath that surface, a dangerous ember still smoldered. It was the old family feud, a bitter rivalry with the neighboring Weatherby clan, rekindled by greed, pride, and blood debts that had never truly been settled. The two families had once been business partners, co-owning acres of fertile land along the riverbank. But whispers of betrayal, land deeds forged, harvest profits siphoned, had splintered that partnership decades earlier. The feud lay dormant for years, until a Holloway foreman was found beaten nearly to death near the Weatherby property line. The man's account was hazy. He swore he had been ambushed, but in the saloons and marketplaces of the county, everyone assumed the same thing. The Weatherbys were sending a message. This act of violence reawakened the Holloway patriarch's thirst for vengeance. By candlelight, he gathered his sons, speaking in the clipped, deliberate tones of a man plotting something permanent. Farmers reported seeing armed Holloway men patrolling the estate at night, rifles slung over their shoulders, dogs set loose along the fence line. Meanwhile, Weatherby hands retaliated by poisoning two of the Holloway's prize horses, a silent but unmistakable warning. The tension infected every corner of the community. Shopkeepers found themselves forced to choose sides, refusing service to members of the rival family. Marriages were broken off when young lovers from each clan were discovered meeting in secret. The sheriff, already viewed as little more than a Holloway puppet, ignored most incidents. Unless it was the Weatherbys in trouble, in which case the law descended swiftly. The final spark came one autumn night when the Holloway barn mysteriously went up in flames. Witnesses claimed to have seen figures moving in the cornfields, their faces masked by kerchiefs. The patriarch didn't wait for proof. The next day, he sent a detachment of his men to the Weatherby property with orders to settle matters once and for all. What happened that night is still spoken of in hushed tones in Holloway County. Gunshots in the dark, blood in the river, and the chilling certainty that the feud had crossed a line it could never return from. By dawn, the estate's soil was soaked with more than just water from the fire brigade's hoses. By the early 1900s, the Holloway family was no longer a unified force. The once imposing dynasty that had ruled over the plantation with an iron grip was splintering into factions, each consumed by greed, resentment, and whispered accusations of betrayal. The patriarch's death had left a power vacuum, and in the absence of a clear leader, ambition ran wild. The eldest son, Nathaniel Holloway, insisted the estate and all its holdings were his birthright. He had been groomed since childhood to inherit the wealth and command the laborers, but his siblings were not willing to concede. His younger brother Elias quietly built alliances with several influential townsmen, men who owed him favors or feared the secrets he kept locked away. Some claimed Elias had proof of financial fraud committed by Nathaniel during the lean years, while others hinted that Elias knew far darker truths about their father's death. Meanwhile, the Holloway daughters played their own dangerous game. Clara, the second eldest, had married into another wealthy family, but her loyalties remained suspect. She argued that the plantation should be sold off before it collapsed under debt and scandal, while her younger sister Beatrice was rumored to be hiding valuable heirlooms, perhaps even gold, from the rest of the family. Dinner at the Holloway mansion became a battlefield in its own right. Heated arguments erupted over inheritance, accusations were thrown across the table, and more than once, a wine glass shattered against the wall. Servants told stories of voices raised long into the night, of doors slammed hard enough to rattle the old house's bones, and of family members locking their rooms for fear of what might happen while they slept. Tensions boiled over one autumn evening when a family meeting turned into a full-blown confrontation. Nathaniel accused Elias of forging documents to siphon money from the estate's accounts, while Elias countered by revealing letters suggesting Nathaniel had secretly sold off parcels of Holloway land to pay gambling debts. The argument ended only when Beatrice, pale and trembling, stood and declared that if they continued, there would be no family left to fight over anything at all. But it was too late. The cracks in the Holloway legacy had deepened into chasms. From that point forward, each sibling acted less like kin and more like a rival. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and unity, became a stage for betrayal, scheming, and the slow decay of the Holloway name. As the years wore on, whispers of the Holloway plantation's midnight gatherings began circulating among neighboring estates. At first, they were dismissed as the wild fabrications of bored farmhands, tales spun to pass long nights by the hearth. But for those who lived within earshot of the Holloway grounds, the stories were far too consistent, far too chilling to ignore. The accounts always began the same way. Sometime between the chiming of the 11th and 12th hour, the air around the plantation would shift. A damp, heavy stillness would settle over the land, as though the wind itself were holding its breath. Witnesses claimed to see shadowy figures moving in single file from the main house toward the old sycamore grove, a place already steeped in dark history, said to have been the site of unsanctioned burials during the earliest years of the Holloways' ownership. Under the gnarled canopy, strange symbols, carved deep into the trunks, would catch the glint of lantern light. What happened next was never clearly seen, but there were reports of low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to warp the air, twisting it into something unnervingly alive. On some nights, observers swore they heard muffled screams carried on the wind, abruptly silenced as though swallowed by the earth itself. Locals began to notice a pattern. After these gatherings, one or more of the enslaved workers would vanish without explanation. The official line from the Holloways was that they had fled in the night, but no one ever saw them again, alive or dead. The most disturbing account came from a former stable boy who, years later, confessed to sneaking out to watch one of these rituals from the safety of a nearby thicket. He claimed to have seen members of the Holloway family standing in a circle, their faces painted in ash and blood, surrounding something, or someone, bound at the center. He couldn't tell whether it was an animal or a person, only that the cries it made would haunt him until his dying day. By the mid-1800s, the midnight rituals had become a subject of dread and fascination alike. Outsiders rarely spoke of them in public, fearing retribution, but the Holloways themselves seemed to revel in the power these whispers gave them. For the family, the fear they inspired wasn't a side effect, it was the point. The rituals never stopped. Not during the war, not even after the plantation began to decay. And if the locals are to be believed, they continue still, long after the Holloway bloodline was thought to have run dry. In the waning days of the Holloway dynasty, one figure emerged from the shadows, Nathaniel Holloway, the last known direct descendant. Born in 1912, Nathaniel grew up surrounded by whispers, not bedtime stories. The sprawling plantation, by then falling into ruin, was both his playground and his prison. The servants, few and weary, would avert their eyes when his name was spoken, as if to say that the sins of the Holloway bloodline ran too deep for redemption. Nathaniel's life was shaped by contradiction. On one hand, he attended prestigious schools in Charleston, wearing fine suits stitched in Savannah and learning the manners expected of Southern gentlemen. On the other, he carried an invisible weight, the legacy of violence, greed, and superstition that clung to his family name. While classmates spoke of football games and dances, Nathaniel listened to tales of his ancestors' cruelty, of overseers' one missing, of curses placed upon anyone who dared wrong the Holloways, and of the night his great-grandfather allegedly sealed a pact in blood to protect the plantation's wealth. In his 20s, Nathaniel became an enigmatic figure in local society. Rumors claimed he dabbled in the occult, collecting arcane books and holding gatherings in the crumbling parlor where candlelight threw warped shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Guests were chosen carefully, wealthy investors, politicians, and those who believed power could be summoned as easily as it could be inherited. It was said that after these meetings, strange cries echoed from the plantation grounds, and the smell of burning herbs drifted across the marsh. Nathaniel never married, though stories circulated of secret lovers, some vanishing without explanation. One woman, a schoolteacher from Beaufort, was last seen entering the Holloway estate in 1941. Her disappearance sparked a county-wide search that yielded nothing but a torn shoe found near the overgrown family cemetery. By the 1950s, Nathaniel lived almost entirely in seclusion, speaking to no one but a single servant who was paid handsomely to remain loyal. Locals who passed by claimed they saw him pacing the veranda at night, muttering under his breath as though arguing with unseen forces. When he died in 1962, the official cause was listed as heart failure, but those who viewed the body swore his face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, and his hands were curled as if clutching something that wasn't there. With Nathaniel's death, the Holloway bloodline came to an abrupt end, or so the town believed. Some whispered there were illegitimate heirs scattered across the South, each unknowingly carrying a fragment of the Holloway curse. And if the stories are true, the plantation's final chapter may not have been written after all. By the mid-20th century, the Holloway plantation had transformed from a place of wealth and power into a skeletal ruin. The once grand mansion, which had been the pride of the Holloway dynasty, stood atop the hill like a wounded animal, its windows black and hollow, its roof sagging, and ivy crawling over its brick walls as if nature were trying to bury it alive. Locals avoided the property entirely, crossing the road rather than pass too close. It wasn't just the decay that kept people away. It was the stories. Over the years, whispers had grown about strange lights flickering in the upstairs windows, despite the house having no electricity. Some claimed they had seen a figure, tall, thin, dressed in outdated clothes, pacing slowly back and forth in the study. Others swore they'd heard the sound of a woman sobbing drifting down from the second floor, only for the noise to vanish when they approached. The surrounding land fared no better. The sprawling fields, once meticulously plowed, were now overrun with weeds and twisted trees. Fences collapsed in on themselves. Barns and sheds leaned precariously, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. Even the well, which had once been a vital source of water for the plantation, was now boarded over. Not just to keep people from falling in, but according to legend, to keep something from climbing out. By the 1960s, thrill-seeking teenagers began daring each other to spend the night in the mansion. Few ever made it past midnight. They would come back pale and trembling, muttering about shadows that move, on their own, or a suffocating feeling as if the air itself pressed against their lungs. A local boy claimed he had found a diary in one of the upstairs bedrooms, its pages filled with ramblings in an unrecognizable hand, ending abruptly with the words, "It's here. It wants me." The Holloway ruin had become more than just an abandoned house. It was a warning, a reminder of the plantation's dark legacy, the curses whispered in hushed tones, and the belief that some places never truly let go of the horrors committed there. Even in ruin, the Holloway plantation commanded fear, as though it still had unfinished business with the living. The Holloway plantation had always been a place of wealth and power, but by the late 1800s, it carried a reputation that no amount of money could buy back. It was no longer just a grand estate. It was a place spoken of in hushed tones, where visitors left quickly and locals crossed themselves as they passed. Old field hands and former servants told stories of strange happenings that plagued the Holloway family for generations. Livestock found dead with no wounds, mirrors shattering without cause, rooms that remained icy cold even in the sweltering southern summer. The most superstitious swore they'd seen shadowy figures pacing the upper balconies at night, figures with faces that were familiar yet impossible to place. Some claimed the family was cursed from the moment the first Holloway slave ship docked in Charleston. An enslaved woman, brought from the Gold Coast, was said to have been beaten to death after defying her master. Before she died, she allegedly spat a final warning. Your bloodline will choke on the gold it steals. Whether this curse was real or imagined, tragedy certainly seemed to cling to the Holloways. In 1873, a fire tore through the eastern wing of the house, killing 2 servants and a young Holloway cousin. Though officially deemed an accident caused by faulty wiring, whispers suggested the fire had been deliberately set by a Holloway themselves in an act of madness. The family tried to keep up appearances, hosting lavish dinners and masquerade balls, but more often than not, guests left unsettled. Some reported hearing faint weeping coming from the locked servants' quarters long after the party had ended. Others swore that portraits in the dining room seemed to follow them with their eyes. By the turn of the century, no one wanted to work at Holloway Plantation for long. Wages were high, but the cost of one's peace of mind was higher. Those who left often refused to talk about what they had seen, though one gardener, years later, would mutter, "The ground ain't right there. It never was." Whether the curse was the invention of gossip or something darker, it had become an inseparable part of the Holloway story. And for those who believed, it was only a matter of time before the curse demanded more lives. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Holloway Plantation was no longer merely an old southern estate. It had become a whispered legend of dread. Locals avoided the overgrown path leading to its gates, and children dared each other to touch the rusting iron fence, claiming you could hear the screams if you pressed your ear against the bars. Newspapers cyanily printed sensational stories, a traveling peddler vanishing after spending the night nearby, hunters finding mutilated animal carcasses arranged in ritual-like circles on the property's edge, shadowy figures spotted in the windows long after the family had supposedly abandoned the home. Each report added another brick to the wall of fear that surrounded the Holloway name. Former workers spoke in hushed tones of strange rules they'd been forced to follow. Never enter the east wing after dark, never touch the silver lockbox in the master's study, and never, under any circumstance, look into the reflecting pond alone. Those who broke these rules claimed to suffer nightmares so vivid they began to question their own sanity. But what truly cemented the estate's dark reputation was the way tragedy seemed to stalk anyone connected to it. In 1907, a historian named Robert Kinley visited the property to document its architecture. Within weeks, he was found dead in his boarding house, a look of horror frozen on his face. In 1914, a pair of journalists, hoping to expose the Holloway curse, disappeared entirely, their abandoned typewriter found on the porch with a single, unfinished sentence. "It waits beneath the floor." Even those who dismissed the supernatural couldn't deny the estate had a magnetic pull. Urban explorers, thrill-seekers, and amateur occultists traveled miles just to set foot on its rotting verandas. Many left with nothing more than ghost stories, but some never left at all. By the mid-20th century, the Holloway Plantation was widely regarded as one of the most haunted and dangerous places in the South. Not because of any single event, but because of the relentless accumulation of horror, generation after generation of cruelty, tragedy, and unexplainable events layered over the land like a shroud. And the locals? They still cross the street when walking past its property line. They don't look at it, they don't talk about it, and they certainly don't go near it after dark. No matter how many historians, journalists, or amateur sleuths have tried to piece together the truth about Holloway Plantation, the story remains riddled with gaps, dark, echoing voids where answers should be. Records are missing, sometimes in strangely targeted ways. Census documents from certain years exist in perfect condition, yet the Holloway entries are either smudged beyond recognition or cut cleanly out of the page. The county archives tell a similar tale. One clerk claimed that entire boxes of 19th century plantation records were lost in a mysterious fire back in 1923, yet the rest of the courthouse remained untouched. Some even speculate that descendants of the Holloways, or those with an interest in keeping the family's secrets buried, ensured that the trail would stay cold. Then there's the matter of the so-called hidden ledger. Local legend insists that William Holloway kept a personal journal separate from the plantation's official account books, where he documented far more than crop yields and expenses. This ledger, according to whispers, detailed names, dates, and transactions of an altogether more sinister nature. People bought and sold quietly, punishments carried out in secret, and meetings with men whose reputations were even blacker than his own. If it exists, no one has ever produced it. But the most chilling unanswered question is what truly happened. Add to the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people who vanished from Holloway land over the decades. Did they flee in the night, swallowed up by the swamps to the south? Were they sent elsewhere, traded away to even crueler fates? Or did something far worse occur? Something that no official record could ever safely contain. Even the ruins of the plantation itself seem to conspire against those who search for answers. Walls collapse just when teams get close to certain areas. Strange sinkholes appear overnight, swallowing entire sections of ground where excavation had been planned. And on more than one occasion, seasoned researchers have simply walked away from the investigation without explanation, abandoning their notes and refusing to discuss what they'd seen or felt while on the property. The Holloway story is less a neat historical narrative and more a labyrinth with no center, each turn leading deeper into uncertainty. For every scrap of evidence uncovered, 3 more questions arise. Perhaps that's why the tale still haunts locals to this day, not because of what we know, but because of the cold, unnerving truth that some secrets are meant never to be unearthed. Today, the Holloway plantation exists in a strange limbo between history and legend, a place that is simultaneously preserved and avoided. The sprawling estate still stands, its brick walls weathered but unyielding, as if daring time itself to erase them. Preservationists have made efforts to catalog its architecture and protect it as a historic site, but they tread carefully. The Holloway name carries weight in this part of the South, and not the kind that inspires pride. Official tours are rare, and even when they are offered, certain rooms remain off-limits without explanation. Local guides, when pressed, offer vague remarks about safety hazards or unstable flooring, but their eyes tell a different story, a quiet warning that some parts of the Holloway house should remain unseen. Even the historical placards outside avoid certain details, focusing instead on the plantation's agricultural achievements while neatly sidestepping the human cost. In recent years, paranormal investigators have taken an interest in the estate, claiming it to be one of the most active locations in the region. They report hearing muffled voices when no one else is in the house, the faint scent of smoke lingering in rooms untouched by fire, and cold spots in the hallways where the Holloways' more gruesome history is said to have unfolded. One well-known investigator swears they caught a recording of a woman's voice whispering, "Don't let them see," in the upstairs corridor, a phrase that has become part of the local lore. Meanwhile, descendants of the Holloway family remain scattered, many of them keeping their connection to the estate hidden. A few have attempted to distance themselves entirely, changing their surnames to avoid recognition. Still, every now and then, someone claiming Holloway blood will emerge, usually to dispute or downplay the more sinister tales attached to their ancestors. But their protests rarely change public perception. In the collective mind of the community, the Holloways will forever be the embodiment of power twisted into cruelty. The plantation's continued presence is almost a challenge to the living, a reminder that some stains on history cannot be scrubbed away, no matter how carefully they are rewritten. Whether the Holloway legacy is preserved as a cautionary tale or allowed to fade into rumor, one thing is certain. Its shadow still stretches long over the land where it once ruled. The Holloway Plantation was never meant to be a place for children, at least not in the way a home should be. Yet, as decades passed, the ground saw the laughter, cries, and eventual silence of countless young lives. The Holloway family had a habit, some called it a curse, of bringing children into their fold, whether by birth, adoption, or less lawful means. These children were often told they were lucky to be part of the grand estate, but behind closed doors, luck was the last word anyone would use. Letters found hidden in the attic decades later revealed a chilling reality. The Holloway children were raised in an atmosphere of fear and silence. They were expected to carry themselves with perfect manners at all times, to smile when guests visited, and to never, under any circumstances, speak of the strange events that happened within the manor's walls. Some accounts describe being woken in the night to stand for hours in the dark hallway, listening to whispered arguments echoing from the parlor below. Others spoke of being punished for looking out of certain windows, as if the very act of seeing beyond the estate was an unforgivable sin. One particularly disturbing account came from a former housemaid who fled the estate in 1911. She claimed the children were used as pawns in the Holloway family's twisted games, forced to repeat stories about phantoms in the woods to frighten visitors, or to stand at the edge of the property's tree line, unmoving, as a show of the family's eerie discipline. The Holloway plantation lies quiet now, its sprawling fields overrun with tangled weeds and the echoes of centuries gone by. Inside the crumbling manor, dust coats every surface, and time has turned the once grand furniture into fragile relics. But in the main hallway, above the warped staircase, hangs a single surviving artifact that refuses to fade: the portrait of the Holloway family. At first glance, it seems like any stiff 19th century depiction: stern patriarch, stoic matriarch, children arranged like porcelain dolls. Yet there's something unsettling in their expressions, a subtle tightness around the mouths, an almost imperceptible fear in the youngest child's eyes, and an unnatural shadow pooling at the edges of the canvas. Locals whisper that no matter where you stand, the family's gaze follows you, heavy and watchful. Visitors who've dared to step inside tell of an unshakable feeling that the portrait is more than just paint and canvas, that it's a prison for something older, darker, and infinitely patient. Some claim the figures shift slightly over time, their expressions changing, as though silently recounting horrors the walls dare not speak aloud. In many ways, the portrait is the perfect reflection of the Holloway legacy. Beautiful on the surface, but haunted by the sins beneath. It stares out at the world, unblinking, as if daring anyone to truly uncover the truth buried in the soil of this cursed land. Perhaps that is why the Holloway plantation still stands, not as a monument to history, but as a warning. And as the last light fades through its broken windows, the silent portrait waits, watching, knowing that someday someone will come too close, and the cycle will begin again. The Holloway plantation lies quiet now, its sprawling fields overrun with tangled weeds and the echoes of centuries gone by. Inside the crumbling manor, dust coats every surface, and time has turned the once grand furniture into fragile relics. But in the main hallway, above the warped staircase, hangs a single surviving artifact that refuses to fade: the portrait of the Holloway family. At first glance, it seems like any stiff 19th century depiction: stern patriarch, stoic matriarch, children arranged like porcelain dolls. Yet there's something unsettling in their expressions, a subtle tightness around the mouths, an almost imperceptible fear in the youngest child's eyes, and an unnatural shadow pooling at the edges of the canvas. Locals whisper that no matter where you stand, the family's gaze follows you, heavy and watchful. Visitors who've dared to step inside tell of an unshakable feeling that the portrait is more than just paint and canvas, that it's a prison for something older, darker, and infinitely patient. Some claim the figures shift slightly over time, their expressions changing, as though silently recounting horrors the walls dare not speak aloud. In many ways, the portrait is the perfect reflection of the Holloway legacy. Beautiful on the surface, but haunted by the sins beneath. It stares out at the world, unblinking, as if daring anyone to truly uncover the truth buried in the soil of this cursed land. Perhaps that is why the Holloway Plantation still stands, not as a monument to history, but as a warning. And as the last light fades through its broken windows, the silent portrait waits, watching, knowing that someday someone will come too close, and the cycle will begin again.